Why, hello, we meet again. I'm back here with another video, and I guess this is livey live this time. I'm gonna do one right after this. I'm gonna just still leave in the private mode because I kind of want to settle in with it, and in case anything becomes kind of like weird or I have to kind of rephrase what I want to do, then I'll just do that, and then I can just upload it shortly after. So tonight, at least part one of my night tonight, is just walking through this article by, okay, interestingly enough, I'm a little uncertain how to pronounce the name. So we have Jedediah or Jedaliah Braun, and then towards the end, it's spelled a little bit differently, and there's something else. So, and I feel like there's a few words here. I always feel like I'm stumbling over, like my native tongue gets a little bit loose and goofy. So here, I just think this is just a typo. Jedhalia Braun. So I'm thinking it's just to kind of make a reference point. I'll just kind of maybe go back and forth between just Mr. Braun, Braun, Braun. I think that'll be a lot easier for this, the all intents and purposes here tonight. So just for this video, I don't want this make this too long. I'm just gonna walk through some points of this article that I found interesting, and I think have just some points to consider. And just as I read it, you'll kind of get probably most likely why I'm pulling this as something to see and to go over. So let's just jump in. I'll do my usual kind of stop start, take a look, and go from there. So as so like this is my first time really doing this live, which is a little bit weird for me. I mean, I really like this function, just to record and then just to load it after that and just let it go. But anywho, so let's just dive in. Morality and abstract thinking: how Africans may differ from Westerns, from Amarin.com. That's not, I didn't put that as the full title. I believe that this was like a lot of submissions there. They're written by someone. They're just featured at American Renaissance. So if you're curious, it's probably this, and I would say in addition, stuff Black people don't like. I don't know if he's changed it yet, but anyway, if he hasn't, that's the original like 1.0 version. American Renaissance, which is abbreviated here, and I believe you just type this into your web browser there, you'll get AmericanRenaissance.com, along with stuff Black people don't like. They're two race realist blogs. They bring in a lot of other points of discussion: genetics, IQ, just social, cultural, racial differences, points of discussion, whatever. So I think this must have been featured there originally, because I kept coming across this over the years. And last night, I think I might have dipped over to it briefly in the Sinji video. I know I dipped over to that Claudine clip too. I was all over the place, but no, I think I did point this out on this one. Or I think actually no, it was the Yvette Carnell video I just uploaded, just kind of reacting to her podcast about the New York Times poor Black boys, rich boy, what have you thing. So, anywho, let's just jump right in and take a look at this. It's not a very long piece. I'll try to, like, for the sake of being concise or more concise, not wander so much. Yeah, I'm always struck by things that I read and, an example, or I want to kind of dig further into a point. So I think for the sake of this, I'm just kind of trying to move very quickly. And then got my old pen and notebook right here. I can always bounce back at the end and kind of fill out a more well-rounded conclusion. So I'm going to go through most of it just reading, but there's a few, one or two parts where I'll just kind of jump around. So again, this is in the description box. You can just go pull it up and take a look along as we go through this together live. So let's dive in. I am an American who taught philosophy in several African universities from 1976 to 1988, and I've lived since that time in South Africa, When I first came to Africa, I knew virtually nothing about the continent or its people, but I began learning quickly. I noticed, for example, that Africans rarely kept promises and saw no need to apologize when they broke them. It was as if they were unaware they had done anything that called for an apology. It took many years for me to understand why Africans behave this way, but I think I can now explain this and other behavior that characterizes Africa. I believe that morality requires abstract thinking, as does planning for the future, and that a relative deficiency in abstract thinking may explain many things that are typically African. What what follows are not scientific findings. There could be an alternative explanation for what I have observed, but my conclusions are drawn from more than 30 years of living among Africans. So here he just kind of lays out his premise, where he's going with this, and just for this is I think this is the first time I really pulled up anything more than human biodiversity, genetics. I mean, this doesn't go into IQ at all. Well, I think they broach it. He broaches it briefly in this, but so again, and this is something I'll have time to return to again and again. I'll just say this: we think about gravity. Like if I take this glass of red wine and I just push it off the table's edge and it falls, we have physics, we have a lot of other hosts of science, sets of science, and mathematics and what have you that kind of give us this reason around if I push that off, why it falls, why it crashes, if I was on Pluto or Venus, the same thing may not happen in the same sense. When we approach IQ, human biodiversity, and these sort of subjects, especially where they relate to differences among peoples, among race, this is especially for non-white people and most particularly Black people. This is where I see so much consternation, so much pushback, and all this type of like very scared, like, oh my God, you can't say that. This is that. That's just racist, white nationalist. All right. Let's just unpack that because I know going forward, because I've read this probably years ago in full and maybe have come to this once or twice before, but I was rereading this obviously within the past hour just to get myself ready to do this. And I just don't want to make too many stops and starts. Just turn off like all the things you think you know. Try to check a lot of those, confirmation biases you may have. Check the whole, you can't say this, can't say that. Just check a lot of things and just listen. Let me read his points and maybe offer some things where, I probably most likely kind of support or can kind of give some credence to what's being suggested here. Obviously, like again, because he lays it out here, these are not scientific findings. So just keep that in mind too. These are not scientific findings. And that's one thing. Here I go. I'm going to do that again. This is supposed to be a quick one because I really want to get in the Hotep alt-right video tonight. And it's getting a little bit on the later side and got to get up and do my yoga. My yoga, yo. So it's going to be a busy weekend. So let's just jump in. Also, sorry, one last thing. The second link is to this. I know I pulled this up during the Sinji video about the firefighter story about this Black firefighter chief. Well, he wasn't a chief necessarily, but I know I pulled this article up before, so I'll probably return to this one as well because it's actually, funnily enough, kind of right here in the middle where there's some things that kind of bleed back into this. So anyway, let's keep going. First inklings about what may be a deficiency in abstract thinking came from what I began to learn about African languages. In a conversation with students in Nigeria, I asked, how would you say that a coconut is about halfway up the tree in their local language? You can't say that, they explained. All you could say is that it is up. How about right at the top? Nope, just up. In other words, there appeared to be no way to express gradations. Quick pause. Expressing gradations, like there's one, there's zero, and then in between there's being nothing at zero, and then there being one thing. Beyond that, I don't know how far have we counted, and and just the kind of general human consciousness, like the trillions, billions, quadrillions. There's a difference between saying you have one chair, you have no chairs. And something with listening to the term gradations always, when I remember reading this years ago, when it kind of just started to tickle some things inside me, like, well, that's one thing I kind of maybe experienced particularly like even just in some of the conversations that I've covered here on this channel with, and maybe this is almost kind of echoes a bit into echo echoes back into some discussion we've had so far about the Black women, welfare, feminism, Black community falling apart, Black men, no jobs. There's a lot of ways in a lot of these discussions that I find most Black people in general, they can't say things, they can't really flesh things in these in concrete functions. It's this all or nothing kind of zero sum arguments, or there's just this lack of conception of like, it's one thing for someone to be unemployed, and then you have to get to a couple of other steps to express that more fully and with more nuance. So just without branching too far off, I'll make a note to myself, like express gradations. That's something that I think there's some more points that he makes later on that become a little bit more clear to express that. So I'll just leave that there. There appeared to be no way to express gradations. Um, that's something I've experienced with in thinking and dealing uh, with Black people, Black thought for for over much of time. So, a few years later in Nairobi, I learned something else about African languages when two women expressed surprise at my English dictionary. Isn't English your language? They asked. Yes, I said. It's my only language. Then why do you need a dictionary? They were puzzled that I needed a dictionary, but I was puzzled by their puzzlement. I explained that there are times when you hear a word you're not sure about, and so you look it up. But if English is your language, they asked, how can there be words you don't know? What? I said. No one knows all the words in his language. But we know all the words of Kikuyu. Every Kikuyu does, they replied. I was even more surprised, but gradually dawned on me that since their language is entirely oral, it exists only in the minds of the Kikuyu speakers. Since there is a limit to what the human brain can retain, the overall size of a language remains more or less constant. A written language, on the other hand, existing as it does partly in the millions of pages of the written word, grows far beyond the capacity of anyone to know it in its entirety. But the size of a language is limited. It follows that the number of concepts it contains will also be limited, and hence that both language and thinking will be impoverished. So, and just right there in that paragraph, like that's one thing that it when people kind of peel back the layers and when you get, past some of the kind of more hot button issues, like, are you saying people like Black people and, people sub-Saharan Africa or below the equator, the sun people versus the ice people, and they kind of, I don't know if John Derbyshire was one who originally coined it, but he's kind of been kind of associated with that phrasing. When you see in, well, I don't know if this, it probably doesn't help me to break off right yet because there's actually a direct example here and this those who can see on the blog. But that's arguably something to consider. So, in terms of what makes maybe Black Africans and people descended from sub-Saharan Africans over time, even across the diaspora, and even with now approximately 500, maybe a little bit more so years, give or take, with the mostly European Western world, there's just this there's a stark difference when you have something that you have to write down over time. Like, every year people may log like a family trip or they do like a photo album for this event or certain holiday. The continued practice of a people of writing something down is so you have to kind of remove here any value judgments about Black, African, sub-Saharan people not writing anything down, not having written language, versus mostly white Europeans, and I mean you can even branch into like parts of most of Asia, or at least a good fair amount of parts, like think of your Chinese characters or Japanese, the actual writing of language over time. That is something that's a distinct marker in the sense that it makes a difference when you have to write something down over time versus sharing something orally. Like, I think of the difference between, like, for instance, instead of playing telephone, if you write a note and pass it around, you have hard, concrete words and letters on a page that everyone in that 10-person approximate circle can read. But in oral language, as we see through like the game of telephone and the very rough kind of analogy to that, is over time even the game, people can maybe do it pretty clearly, but the people whispering in their ear a certain phrase or certain sentence, by the time the first person says it and it wraps all the way around through the 10th person, some detail may have changed, a word may have been adapted, maybe another adjective or what have you ends up finding its way in there. Instead of calling, I called Tom, I told Tom, just any of those types of variations that tend to mutate when people are having a verbal discussion and just sharing things verbally. So I'll leave that there. So we go a little further down. Again, you should pull this up and you can take a look alongside me. So I'm going to skip a bit of this here in the middle because he gives quite a few, he returns to the same point continuously, so I can just move through and keep this pretty tight comparatively speaking to most of my creative output in my, the mini treaty. No, I was thinking about that treatise. Like, actually, let me do something real quick. This is bugging me earlier, and I was mulling around treatise. What is the plural form of like many? It's not treatises. A written work dealing formally and systemically with the subject. I like Merriam-Webster. How about some in the comment section? I see it's 2 silent watchers or something like that. Thumbs up for Merriam-Webster, eh? What is the plural form of it? I don't even know if there is one. Systemic exposition or argument in writing, including a methodological discussion of the facts and principles involved and conclusions reached. A treatise on higher education. I don't think there's a plural form of treatise. Okay. That was bugging me. And then as I was making my little, whatever here, I really wanted to know that. So I'll go investigate if there's a plural form of that word. Maybe not. Who knows? Okay. Give me a second here to see where I was going or what I wanted to pull. So he gets a couple breakoffs here in terms of Zulu. Let's just hone in on this one. Note the Zulu entry for obligation as if to bind one's feet. An obligation binds you, but it does so morally, not physically, is an abstract concept, which is why there is no word for it in Zulu. So what did the authors of the dictionary do? They took this abstract concept and made it concrete. Feet, rope, and tying are all tangible and observable, and therefore things all Blacks will understand, whereas many will not understand what an obligation is. The fact that they had to define it in that way is by itself compelling evidence for my conclusion that Zulu thought has a few abstract concepts and indirect evidence for the view that Africans may be deficient in abstract thinking. I want to move back just a second. All of a sudden it hit me. This actually should have come first, but we'll just read this briefly. My queries into Zulu began when I rang the African language department at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg and spoke to a white guy. Did precision exist in Zulu language prior to European contact? Oh, he said, that's a very Eurocentric question, and simply wouldn't answer. I rang again, spoke to another white guy, and got a virtually identical response. So where we're kind of moving here is just this idea of when you can't think of something in full. Like if you just have a word that says you have no chairs, like whatever word, and none or 0 chairs, and then the only other word as an alternative for you is many chairs. That many could be 5, it could be 10, it could be 1,000. So that disconnect in understanding of something, just not having many different ways to kind of explain it, that's a functionally different way of thinking that can have an effect on a culture, on society, and how people differ from each other in terms of thought. If it's like the idea, I think I've made this point once before, like the idea of like computer coding and language and just one of those really basic concepts, not across all points of programming, but when I first was able to someone made this understood to me, And in some coding, also some disciplines of math, there's this concept of zeros and ones. There's either nothing, that's a zero, or there's a one. And in a lot of the language just breaks down in terms of programming, in that subset is just zeros and ones, zeros and ones. There's not 5, there's no 10, there's no 1,000. And you get something that is built, and you have this thing that's created from that sequence. But the sequence in itself is just, there's two options. There's nothing or there's one. And then from there, you can have multipliers of 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 next to each other, building outwards. But 0, nothing, and 1 is a very limited conceptual universe unto itself. Let me break over here because there's a point, there's something comparable here in the those who can see why recolonization future orientation piece. So let's see. Abstraction, primitive extremes. Sometimes looking at the extremes can help us better understand the middle. For ground zero of ethnic groups who lack abstract reasoning, look no further than tribes who can't count. Among Amazonian pariahs, many peculiarities is an almost complete lack of numeracy, an extreme rare linguistic trait. The language contains no words at all for discrete numbers and only 3 that approximate some notion of quantity. Hoi, small size or amount. Hoi, somewhat larger size or amount. And bagasio, which can mean either to cause to come together or a bunch. And then like this is this nice follow-up. So we talked about so that one just kind of gave us an idea of like numeracy and like counting, which breaks off directly from here. But even this one offers a little bit of something that offers a little bit additional in terms of people who have no concept of time. The Amandawa language has no word for time, or indeed of time periods such as month or year. The people do not refer to their ages, but rather assume different names in different stages of their lives or as they achieve different status within the community. But perhaps most surprising is the team's suggestion that there is no mapping between concepts of time passage and movement through space. Ideas such as an event having passed or being well ahead of another are familiar from many languages. In Amawandan, no such constructs exist. So then tying that back into Mr. Braun's experiences here in South Africa and delving into Zulu in languages. So again, like I said before about walking back some things we think we know, we hear about racial differences, IQ differences, ethnic differences, human differences amongst populations. When we kind of get away from some things that just are, that have been packaged, that have been said, they may have not been so expressed. So when we walk away from just the IQ question, or are blacks dumber than such, or Italians and Irish, genetically inferior compared to like Eastern European, Scandinavians or Slavs, like worse than Western Europeans. I mean, when we move away from a lot of those things, and we just look, and in this specific example that we're looking at, the South American natives, and then also here in South Africa, which is where this is where he's kind of moving through. When we can look at, and then we get away from, it's somebody's skin color, or it's their hair type, even though race is a lot different than those more outwardly presenting characteristics. Some of the racial differences and ethnic and cultural differences break down to ways of thinking and the way we interact with each other. And there's, again, like you said, it's not science. I mean, there is some science out there and some, things that people have been able to find thus far. And there's a lot of reasons why there isn't more literature, more explanation out there due to political reasons, political correctness reasons, etc. But when we just are saying, well, if there's a difference between races or some races and cultural and ethnic groups based on their perception of time and the way we explain things, that's something that we should address, and we can unload and unpack, certain amounts of angst, bitterness, and this need to feel defensive and attacking people, because these are things that should be discussed, and especially in terms of space and time and conceptualization. This is, it's the way we deal and move through pretty much all of our lives. And to most of us listening here or watching this are living in a first world Western society. These are things that, affect that. Because they said, just go back here, they have no word for time or indeed periods such as month or year. And just think about the world that we, live in, we a month. So just and think about just numerically the measurements that are involved in how we interact with the world. So a minute is 60 seconds. An hour is 60 minutes. A day is 24 hours. A week is 7 days. On average, and this is where it does get a little wonky even just here, a month is typically 4-ish weeks. A year is 12 months. And then, we can think then a decade is 10 years. A century is 100 years. So so just from the second out to a century, there are these built-in measurable concepts of time as to how we predominantly relate to the world. And if you don't have that and you never have that, you build your language or your ways of experiencing being in the world, you're going to live and experience and kind of evolve in a place that's going to be very, very different from people who have. And particularly if that way of thinking has kind of evolved, expanded, and pretty much encompasses pretty much the majority of the planet in most ways, then it has some bearing on your existence. Let's return to the article. Another moment here. Okay, so I'm going to jump in right here. Time is another abstract concept with which Africans seem to have difficulties. I began to wonder about this in 1998. Several Africans drove up in a car and parked right in front of mine, blocking it. Hey, I said, you can't park here. Oh, are you about to leave? They asked in a perfectly polite and friendly way. No, I said, but I might later. Park over there. And they did. While the possibility that I might want to leave later was obvious to me, their thinking seemed to encompass only the here and now. If you're leaving right now, we understand, but otherwise, what's the problem? I had other such encounters, and the key question always seemed to be, are you leaving now? The future, after all, does not exist. It will exist, but it doesn't exist now. People who have difficulty thinking of things that do not exist ipso facto will have difficulty thinking about the future. It appears that the Zulu word for future, isikati, is the same as the word for time as well as for space. Realistically, this means that these concepts probably do not exist in Zulu thought. It also appears that there is no word for the past, meaning the time preceding the present. The past did exist, but no longer exists. Hence, people who have problems thinking of things that do not exist will have trouble thinking of the past as well as the future. So that's a really that really all jumps out there, especially the analogy. We think of first when I said time, I was like, I just kind of invisibly filled in CP, color people time, just kind of as a joke. But so there you go. I'll just use that and not branch off too much. So if you think about the whole concept of color people time and what that tends to mean and what that tends to suggest, it's very interesting that it's kind of obvious that there's a reason that concept evolves, not just, and even the way, like, mostly amongst Black people in America, and I bet there's probably some that this happens in what other parts of the world across diaspora amongst us, that we joke about this or it becomes this thing to talk about because there's something noticeable about us and our kind of dealing with time. So speaking of time, that directly moves us over to back to those who can see. Yes. Oh, Yemi Boateng. I know I just butchered that. I apologize. Ghanaian commentator on the BBC. Yes, Africans are capable of keeping time. A red hot stove approach is needed to arrest this bad attitude. Africans in the diaspora learn to keep the time. We show up at work or appointments on time because there's a price to pay for tardiness. Africans have a saying: Africans do not wait for time. Rather, time waits for Africans. Time is money, and we are paying a heavy price for our tardiness. Excuse me. So so there's something different that we notice about you know Africans in general, particularly sub-Saharan Africans in time. So when we take color time and then we take these two kind of this more I'm gonna read this one real quick above because this ties into the experience that I've actually had. Nothing is safe from African time. I have been to weddings that started up to 3 hours later than the advertised time. With this tradition, everything in the continent is always running behind schedule. For Africa to develop, our ideology has to change. This thinking keeps Africa as one of the world's poorest regions. Yeah, I remember going to a wedding once when I was a kid, and yeah, we all were there in church, and they didn't. The bride was there, but the groom didn't get there until about maybe for like it was like that bad. I think it was like hour or two later. We were just sitting in the church, everybody just kind of sweating it out there. So if we take these kind of lived in experience and feed them back into here, so what Mr. Braun is kind of uncovering is that there could be an issue between there's something conceptually just lacking in African history, African evolution, and language, that these concepts just aren't there. So then we get to like the output later on, especially as we interact with the Western world over the past, approximately 500-600 years or so, in the more immediate sense, that there is a lot of time without these concepts. They take time to be learned. And like I said, in the Western world, we tend to, well, more often than not, show up on time and be the places we need to be. But if this is something that conceptually that is never evolved amongst you as a race, as a group of people, it's going to be something that you can learn, that whether it's relatively easy or relatively hard, is something that can be absorbed and learned. But if there's not even words to concretely explain it, and in at the very least not even comparable to what the rest of the world, particularly the white Western European world, you're going to have a deficit. You're going to have a defect. There are things that are going to be hard for you to do. Okay. Okay, I'll just join into this paragraph. In this context, I recall some remarkable discoveries by the late American linguist William Stewart, who spent many years in Senegal studying local languages. Whereas Western cultures internalize norms, don't do that, for a child eventually becomes, I mustn't do that. For an adult, mustn't do that for an adult. African cultures do not. They rely entirely on external controls or on behavior from tribal elders and other sources of authority. When Africans were detribalized, these external constraints disappeared, and since there never were internal constraints, the results were crime, drugs, promiscuity, etc. Where there had been other forms of control, as in white ruled South Africa, colonial Africa, or the segregated American South, this behavior was kept within tolerable limits. But when even these controls disappear, there's often unbridled violence. So, this is interestingly enough, in the Sinji video last night, where it sounds like, maybe to a degree, I can be tongue in cheek and then also being very on point and maybe make an observation that's very solid. And I would take that as one of them. Like I suggested, if we want, some of these things to get back under control to a certain degree. Now, obviously, there's a lot more nuance here, especially when we look at who is committing most of the crime, who is doing most of the aiding and abetting. It doesn't have to be some blanket. Anyway, Jim Crow sundown towns. Maybe that needs to make a comeback, because it's funny, because interesting enough, there's a lot of arguments I find Black women kind of get into, and we having to, like, in these circles always, and in with the outer circles of, especially with Black men, get into these back and forths about welfare and WIC, files out the home, everything went to hell at the stroke of midnight, 1965, etc. And then, oh, well, we used to be so married. Black fathers were in the homes, we were in the church, and da da da. And one thing that I guess I've been trying to, like, that I'm slowly easing out towards, which I can just kind of say here as a point, and that I would like to make to, especially the race realists, the alt writers, the dissident writers, and people who end up observing this from the outside, and kind of like they have questions, and they're like, well, these guys are right. They need to, like, no more welfare, and these single moms, and they get lost in the fact that a lot of these things that you see that are depraved or degenerate, about the kind of average, basic, mostly underclass, but then obviously reads up through every level of Black America. A lot of these problems and things were kept contained when the Black man was in the home, because he had to be in the home. There was no, mostly white, collegey bars, friendly places for them to go mix and mingle. They were in the home because Black people tend to have their own bars, their own restaurants, their own clubs, their own neighborhoods, their own places of being. And they knew that when they moved outside of those certain boundaries, that, the white man wasn't going to put up with any of their tomfoolery. Like I made the note from the play, the Piano Lesson by August Wilson, and there's a scene. I played Bernice in high school, and she's telling her daughter before she goes out to go run some little errand. She's about 10 years old. She's like, some, don't be going down there showing your color. There were rules that were either legal or just implicit in terms of how Black people, particularly in America, in the South and also in the North, as you saw in certain places, there was a way we interacted with a greater majority white society. And when those rules were there in place, that behavior, as stated here, was kept within tolerable limits. So is this his observations here in Africa, with the, that almost directly parallels to a extent what we saw here in America South, from beginning of importing Black sub African I don't know why I just jumped over that word, importing Black slaves into the Americas, originally particularly North America. That period up into the Civil War, then we get the Reconstruction era, and then we go into kind of Jim Crow, what have you, era up until about the 60s, 70s, when you get a lot of those, like, legal restraints, social restraints, cultural restraints pretty much demolished. So Black people, and it's all like playing roots backwards and putting us all on boats going backwards. Yeah, I guess that's a reasonable solution. I mean, obviously, I'm kind of being facetious here, but also I think what also would just work, and which may not require that much fanfare, is to just bring a lot of those social and implicit controls back. When the behavior is kept within tolerable limits, these things would not be occurring. And then especially those, they're all here race mixing the white women, and the white man needs to do this. Like, you need to just put some bass in your voice and get your balls back from wherever they've been stashed, and basically, this far and no more, Negro. And then that's going to be the long and the short of it. So I don't want to dwell too much on that point, but I thought that was a very interesting paragraph in terms of how he kind of draws this interesting parallel that is, pretty interesting way to look at it from in the Americas. Because again, we're seeing even the conversations I've stumbled on into with other Black women over the past year or so, that, Black women who are in the UK, who are in, maybe some who are in South America, some of the islands, or they're from those places originally, they live in America, some of them still live in Africa itself. It's interesting to see, because we as we've talked, we know that a lot of these same behaviors are happening, whether we're in Americas or we're not, whether we're in the continent of Africa or not. So let's just move into this one. One explanation for this lack of abstract thinking, including the diminished understanding of time, is that Africans evolved in a climate where they could live day to day without having to think ahead. They never developed this ability because they had no need for it. Whites, on the other hand, evolved in circumstances in which they had to consider what would happen if they didn't build stout houses and store enough fuel and food for the winter. For them, it was sink or swim. And at that one paragraph, when that was one of the first things when I kind of delved into race realism, looking at that just the whole broad subjects that arise out of that question. That was one of the probably, like, if I could list like 5 things that I learned initially or was able to think about that just struck me. As someone who grew up in the upper Midwest where it's very cold, you even see this here, black, white, Asian, whatever, when you start buying the bags of salt around October because you're gonna need it. You start pulling out the winter gloves, you go get the like winter coat out of the basement, whatever. So if you think just specifically in a very basic sense about, again, I like what's attributed to John Derbyshire as the sun people and the ice people. So in the sun people below the equator, when you're living in a near constant temperatures that maybe are on average in their 60s, maybe they fluctuate a little bit lower, maybe much higher, into your hundreds. You don't have, it's like people you and me who live in California, because you're Southern California, and they just kind of like just, I mean, you could be there in February and it's 50, 60 degrees, and then if you're like in, I don't know, like Canada or Minnesota or Michigan or, upstate, like far upstate Northeast, wherever, you get those cold climes, that time of year, it's a different way of living and existing. You can see that just in a very basic sense in a continent like America, where the climates vary. Like a couple of years ago, it's like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, they had snow in Alabama or Georgia, someplace down there. And it wasn't like, I remember we were all, I mean, I know this is mean, but we were up here laughing like, really? It was like an inch or two. But they don't keep salt. So there you go. It's the forward thinking of cold versus the lack of necessity. So I don't want to dwell too long. I might just pull this paragraph off and just do a free riff video one day, because this is one of the key things I think when we talk about race realism, difference between whites, blacks, IQ genetics. There's a whole lot of things across that map, but this is just something concrete that I think anyone can grasp. Just in case you're just joining in or you're hearing me kind of, flounder around just because I'm trying to like express how important just this example is. I could have just done a video and just extracted this and talked about it for 20 minutes. So, and then just in the way he's even phrasing this, because this is where anyone gets so lost in whether they're white or black, and we talk about race differences, difference between like ability, race, genetics, IQ, aptitude, whatever. There's just things that evolve for certain people in certain climates that just aren't necessary for folks in others. And if you think of, even just from our pre-human ancestors, you know, 200,000 years ago, up to like, 500,000 years ago, there's just things that were baked into the cake then. They're just so different about us since we spread and moved across Bering Straits. You look at the Soltrian hypothesis and we move through there. I'm gonna make another. I think I might pull the Soltrian hypothesis. Maybe I'll just pull it up as like a link for anybody to look at. And if you want to come back, if you like the video, share, subscribe, leave a comment. I'll maybe just add that in. That was something I've always wanted to talk about. It's an interesting hypothesis to think and then that ties into the Kennewick man. And so people say, we were there's black people want to say we were the first people in America. Everybody want to say they're the first people in this kind of like pissing contest. But I think what's a more logical explanation is we move from, just from what has been theorized, the concept of Pangea, where most of the 7 continents were pretty much connected, and over a very, very long time, they start to separate from each other, and you get the space between the North America and Africa and Europe. But there was a time when these things were a lot closer. And then we get to that, that first big ice age. There was such a long period of time of ice and just enough sheets of ice still connecting places where people could move and frequent. So a lot of different people could have been in North America. Anyway, that's way too much of a tangent, but I'll just read it again because this is how important this paragraph is to me. And I think anyone that's just stumbling upon this information or knowledge, or people who are very familiar with it, who may say, oh, so, and just, I'm just hypothetically, oh, there's this black woman who gets this and she thinks this stuff, yeah, I mean, this is, so I don't want to say like, because obviously I'm not every black person or every black woman by any shape, any metric, but I just remember reading this and really thinking about it deeply. And then it just is like, oh, I can let go. Oh, they're just saying we're monkeys. Oh, we're just this or that. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of reasons, the things that we do to each other that just are maybe more recent affects in the West that make us more monkeys than anything. But if we can maybe go back to the baseline of what programs us at a genetic level, a racial level, things that have been baked into our individual cakes as a race, for almost a couple thousand, if not close to a million years of just basic evolution. Again, for the people in the back. One explanation for this lack of abstract thinking, including the diminished understanding of time, is that Africans evolved in a climate where they could live day to day without having to think ahead. They never developed this ability because they had no need for it. Whites, on the other hand, evolved under circumstances in which they had to consider what would happen if they didn't build stout houses and store enough food or fuel for the winter. For them, it was sink or swim. That's not a value judgment. It's not, and again, we get into this nationalist, supremacist, fear, inferiority, superiority. Like I said before, I was kind of just watching a little bit more Stingy. Now she's on calling white people pigskins and pork rinds and her whole little spiel there. Like when, and then, you can go over someone that's, I mean, more so than not just kind of LARPing, the blacks, they're so subhuman. And we don't have to LARP. We don't have to call each other names. We can just think of conceptual examples and differences that exist in terms of how we think and how we move in the world that don't have to pull anybody down. They're just different. Different doesn't necessarily mean bad. An apple is not an orange. Doesn't mean apples are bad and oranges are good, or vice versa. They're just different, and they offer us a better explanation of who we are, where we're going, and how we interact with each other in the world. All right, let's move a little further in because it's getting pretty much towards the end. Mm-hmm. Okay, here's another tidbit. Some Africans cannot clearly imagine what their own rude behavior feels like to others. In other words, if they cannot put themselves in the other person's shoes, they will be incapable of understanding what rudeness is. For them, what we call rude may be normal and therefore, from their perspective, not really rude. Africans may therefore not be offended by behavior we would consider rude, not keeping appointments, for example. One might even conjecture that African cruelty is not the same as white cruelty, since Africans may not be fully aware of the nature of their behavior, where such awareness is an essential part of real cruelty. And just from that, I just kind of took this understanding of things that we think are that we, and I mean it's a very broad Black, sub-Saharan African descendant racial existence. There's always these kind of like over time these jokes like, we don't do these things that white folks do. And I remember like when I was younger, like it should be this thing like, oh, I remember Anthony was like, we don't put our kids in time out like the white folks. And that just made me kind of just think for a second on like the things that we say make us so different, that if someone, that and not that all white people all put their kids in timeout. Some, there's varying things that they do, but this kind of generalized, very broad sense, well, white folks do X and they put their kids in timeout, and we don't do that. We spank and whoop our kids. Well, that was not to say that all Black or African people do, but we know that that's something very common amongst a lot of us. And see a second here, take a sip. That there's just this distinct difference between what we consider cruel, what they don't consider cruel, and things that we consider like, again, we go back to the word, like the idea of different gradations of things. Like where, for instance, you'll hear stories like, oh, my dad used to, he might have smacked me once. Like, it was some white guy named Biff telling a story about back in 1952, his dad would like, give him some punches. And, now maybe it's more common. You try not to spank at all or hit at all. You've seen, like, it's interestingly enough, I always find it's funny, especially when I talk to especially older working class white men, particularly those who maybe now 2018 would be more like 60, 70, somewhere in that age range, particularly, where they still kind of, and some I've had conversations where I kind of find it funny. They almost sound like a Black person today talking about child discipline, but then I look at their age and they're telling me about the 60s and 70s, and their dads and their parents sound the way Black parents sound today for the most part, even though it's funny, I hear about the whoopings and the spankings and the beatings, but I don't know, I almost feel like maybe in a way, like, I don't know, maybe I just remember these things differently being a younger person in the 90s, in the early 2000s than now. I don't feel like the discussion really happens much, but anyway, they'll talk about their mom or dad like smacking the hell out of them, beating the hell out of them. And they kind of tell it with that grin story, compared to now, or even like, and this is actually this person in particular I'm thinking of is this very Republican Trump guy. Well, no, actually, I didn't know him through the whole Trump election. I'd already wasn't working there anymore. But anyway, I think I just kind of try to draw a little too much from that example. But in closing, I think that was just interesting way of thinking about things that we think are cruel versus maybe what whites consider cruel, because it's just a difference in thinking and a difference in behavior and a difference of being. So I just found that interesting. So I think it's interesting that he makes this point here. Oh, we're actually closing at the end. So actually, since we're that close to the end, I thought this part interesting too. So I think I'll just read the rest of this and kind of round it up here. Africans also tend to litter. To understand this, we must ask why whites don't litter, at least not as much. We ask ourselves, what would happen if everyone threw rubbish everywhere? It would be a mess, so you shouldn't do it. Black's possible deficiency in abstract thinking makes such reasoning more difficult, so any behavior requiring such thinking is less likely to develop in their culture. Even after living for generations in societies where such thinking is commonplace, many still fail to absorb it. And that's again another really great example here that you just kind of can latch onto, and you can compare it to your own existence here, wherever you live, as I mean, as a black or white person, in the Western world particularly. You notice this, like, it's so funny going through some parts, like, I mean, not every, yeah, I avoid not doing it. It's not every place, guys. I'm making broad sweeping generalizations, and I'll let you know when I'm honing in on other ones. Um, the flaming hot Cheeto bags, like, you walk around, like, down certain streets in majority black areas, and you see trash, and it's like, it's always a damn flattened Cheeto bag near, like, the little under sewer grate thing, like, and when he pops out, like, and you see so much like just rubbish. Oh gosh, I'm not British. I wish I didn't use the term rubbish. I can't believe I was using the word rubbish or litter in places, and we just don't think about those things. So like I remember, you think about that, you go to like majority white areas, white suburbs, and first it's like, man, there's no litter everywhere. And it's weird how like people start, you kind of end up drawing this kind of correlation between black areas being trashy and full of garbage or more heavily littered upon versus, majority white or just non-black suburban middle class, upper class areas being less so. And it's one of those things like when, we talk abstractly about crime, like, or people say, oh, I have to move out of the city, because to go to where the good schools are. And it's so like with that, even with that, and then with the litter, you can kind of draw, it's these two things that we can latch onto because they're concrete situations we can describe and make a comparison. But there are also those two of those things that we end up hiding behind to crouch where we're already trying to say or suggest or just kind of clarify about our experiences in different areas where one racial group is more of a majority, one is more of a minority. I just found that kind of a little bit something to riff off there. So this is at the end. Let's just close out with the last statement here. It should go without saying that my observations about Africans are generalizations. I'm not saying that none has capacity for abstract thought or moral understanding. I am speaking of tendencies and averages, which leave room for many exceptions. To what extent my observations about Africans apply to American blacks? American blacks have an average IQ of 85, which is a full 15 points higher than the African average of 70. The capacity for abstract thought is unquestionably correlated with intelligence, so we can't expect American blacks generally to exceed Africans in those respects. Still, American blacks show many of the traits so striking among Africans: low mathematical ability, diminished abstract reasoning, high crime rates, a short time horizon, rudeness, littering, etc. If I only lived among American blacks and not among Africans, I might never have reached the conclusions I have. But the more extreme behavior among Africans makes it easier to perceive the same tendencies among American blacks. And they give his kind of spiel blurb here. So that's the end of of this piece in general. Not in general. That's the end of this blog piece here. And just I had a thought. What's about IQ? You know, I've already gone a bit lengthy here, and I'm gonna make a note to myself because I think now that I finally broken the ice, and because I want to do like some, I mean, actually next video I'm gonna do in about the next 20 minutes. I'm gonna do it private just in case I like goof up. This is just me reading an article and just kind of riffing, and I want to make sure that I like hit the points I want to hit, and I really don't want to go as long as I would in the last one. It was like 2 hours. I was like, whoa, man, I can't believe I can talk that long. But you just get me going, man. And I'm just like, pew, 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 pew. So, I don't think, no, I don't want to think I want to break off. I'll just make a note to myself that I want to come back to the IQ question. I think, particularly being me into individual specifically, and then the circles I kind of have it here online, and the different kind of cross currents of thought. I really want to just find the best way to address the question and present it to Black women, particularly in these circles, to maybe more alt-right, dissident right types, that kind of like of thought, and people that kind of like read and follow and kind of like mesh with on certain things. I just want to come up with a really nice comprehensive video that's not too long. Just put like some key points and observations into one place. But obviously he closed out with it here. I'm just trying to think what's the most general thing I can say. Well, for the first paragraph point here, again, he said these are generalizations. He opened up the article here stating that this is observations. And I think when we to even get to the IQ question, the first things people have to focus on is the word average. When you're dealing with IQ and racial differences, like for instance, I can't think of the best quick analysis. Go. I don't have one right now, damn it. But just think of averages, the basics, the basis of, because actually I might even just do this finally. Read the bell curve and like maybe live stream it with some folks and just like, hey, I'm reading the bell curve. Let's talk about it. Because a lot of my understanding of it in full is just kind of built off maybe a good 5, maybe a little more than 5 years of engaging with people, you know, who've covered the book, who covered the subject from different perspectives. So to actually approach the text itself for the first time would be really awesome. But basically, so the premise is average IQ. There's no way to walk up to every single individual person on the planet, a part of any race, and measure their exact IQ. What we do is we take like averages. Like for instance, we build roads. Some people drive Priuses. Some people drive Ford F-150s. We can't make roads based on, we can't go find every type of car someone drives that has different, like, you know, wheel bearings, different capabilities, different weight impact on the highway. There's just too many people and too many cars to make those type of tailored individual choices to factor into how we plan highways, interstates, road maintenance, etc. But on average, we can gather an average out of like a population of 100,000 people, and we can extrapolate that to maybe, let's just think of a average American city can be anywhere from like 500,000 people up to like maybe 5 or 10 million people in the major city and the surrounding areas. So with those large population of people, there's information we can extract that does not account for every individual person, whatever car they drive, or, you know, is it a, you know, a sedan? Is it a full-size truck? Is it a work van? You know, whatever. But we can take a large populations of people and derive an average amount of information based on a whole large swath of people, and we can make inferences based on that. So before people get so tickled or so weird about race differences, IQ, and intelligence, for Black people and white people, and for everyone else in that spectrum of racial cultural differences, there's been so much kind of poisoning the well, a lot of invective hurled in both directions, and so many things that just get put into it that don't need to be there. And I think that's one of the long-term goal here is to unpack and walk some of those things back. And like these examples here in this article, like I read this maybe 5 or 6, 7 years ago. And as I started the channel and started getting certain things, I really wanted to talk about this because I think it just, again, his generalizations, his observations play back into some of these things that we're trying to measure scientifically in terms of DNA, in terms of genetics, that we can look at, you know, in terms of like societies, different cultures populated by people who are part of this race or that race, or people who are part of, you know, this race plus this religion, or this race plus this kind of cultural practice, this race plus a certain geological, like there's a, you know, if you're X race and you live on a tundra, or if you're X race and you live like, you know, basically right on at sea level, right off of like a body of, you know, fresh, you know, salt water, and those differences. So I really honed in a great way around that out, and I ended up walking into something else as I said that. So I apologize. But again, average IQ is a derivative of average of swaths of people. Most racial populations in this world exist in like the thousands, if not millions. There's no way for everyone to meet every white person, confirm that they all have an IQ of 100 or 80 or 90, or every black person to have 70 or 85 or 60 or 50 or 120. But it's a derivative of the average swaths of large numbers of people that we take this pool from. Like, I guess I'll leave it here because the bell curve itself, when you look at it, it's just giving you an inference based on a whole swath of people. So let's see if there's one. Man, Google works really fast. Mm. So all these goofy bell curves here, because they know people Google this a lot, so you know they want to make sure. Come on, give me the one I'm looking for. Because that one's one you see a lot, but oh, this one, I like this one. Let's see if we can get this full screen. Seriously, I'm gonna close out then. Ooh, uns.com, Underview. It's a really great website. There's some really cool people who publish and write here. Ramsey Paul, I guess, has a link here. He might be one of the bloggers here. Oh, I'll look at. Okay, I'll look at that later because again, I want to make another video tonight. So, I don't want to blur in too much. This has to exist someplace else as an image, but not damn it. This is a delay. Okay. I know it's someplace else again. I don't want to twaddle on too much longer. Another video to make. You should come back for it. I should be done with it. Oh, come back later tonight. Come back in the morning. Oh, no. Come back tonight. So, I think they're just using black and white specifically. And there's other people to talk about. But at the base, I wish you could see me put my pen here in the middle. But just imagine that I'm kind of putting it right here. Well, no, for both races. So let's just go here. There's 85. And then there's just a little bit skewed 100. Maybe this is like 102, 105 or something. So all the bell curve at its basis is suggesting, based on large averages of people, because again, especially just black people, white people, enough, there's millions of us on the planet. There's no way to go and investigate everyone's individual IQ. But from what we've gathered by large swaths of people is on average, all of the bell curve is suggesting is that if you meet someone black, and again, I'd have to dig into the details exactly how they specifying across all people across the planet in the West, in Africa, wherever else on the planet that are, you know, descended from sub-Saharan African peoples. Then also are we including, you know, people north of Sahara? Are we including like Northern Africa? Don't know, but the suggestion is, on average, again, just a large average, at 85, that's suggesting that racially, on average, half of the people that comprise this large swath of people will have an IQ below 85. And then the remaining half of the race is above 85. And then when you get to whites, on average, again, on average, I've seen it more geared as at 100, because the key thing that people talk about, discuss here, is that we're dealing with a 15-point differential between the median. So if half people I meet that are white not I don't even want to phrase that way because then we get really into something I just don't want to do because it's not necessary. It's just suggestive that on average of the full white distribution of an average population size, half of the people will have an IQ below 100, and half of the people will have it above, where the average IQ on average is 100. And so when people say, well, IQ, what does it really mean? Was this like, well, why is it this or that? It's a suggestion. And even that, this is why I like this photo, because this graph, because I've seen this around for years, because it's giving you an idea that when we look at IQ in a measure in terms of where people will fall in terms of what they can do, what they are on average able to do, and what types of, you know, job skills, type of reasoning skills. Now, this was just specifically more focused on jobs and that kind of relationship to where we have kind of on average determined where people's skill set may fall based on average IQ numbers. And it's just giving you an idea. It doesn't mean that anyone, I won't even go there. I've made my point, and I think it's pretty salient just to very basically introduce that point. I like this photo. There's some better ones out there, and I think there's some more that give you a little more overlap amongst different racial groups, but that's for another time. But I'm glad I will just say that, we just kind of jumped in and looked at that because he does mention IQ, and that's something I want to talk about here too. So, what did he say? So then he's giving this kind of comparative roundup about, the difference between African blacks, American black people, and I guess even he's mentioning America specifically, but this also might be something that would kind of apply or stretch out to, our cousins across the pond in the UK. But so that's just kind of where he ends up coming back to in the end. Don't want to rattle on too much. You know how me and so far closing out my videos. I tend to take a long time to say goodbye. So again, I do want to do another one, and I'm going to go get to that. So thank you for reading this article with me. The link's below, and even the link to those who can see is below. So I will catch you later. Toodles.